Okay, and we're good to go. And we are live once again. Now I want to welcome Dacre Stoker. He's going to be sharing some very cool information about Dracula. Dacre, if you would like to introduce yourself and get started, the floor is
Absolutely.
yours.
Thank you, Kevin. First of all, my name is Dacre Stoker. I'm the great grandnephew of Bram Stoker, author of Dracula. I have followed in Bram's legacy, not nearly at his level, but I'm now an international best-selling co-author of two books, Dracula the Undead, which is actually a sequel to Dracula, and Dracul, recently written with J.D. Barker, which is a prequel to Dracula. And I really have to say, hats off though to Kevin Mears for pulling this off. He's a man of great energy and enthusiasm. He actually loaded up his car with some of his buddies from his paranormal show, and I'll never forget it. And I really appreciate it when JD and I were launching Dracul from the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia. You and a bunch of your buddies came and supported us. And that meant an awful lot. And I thank you for coming, making the big drive to that in person. I will say the Rosenbach Museum is a very cool place. Primarily, my interest level is that they actually house and own 125 pages of Bram Stoker's Dracula notes. And these are some of the cool things that I have researched over the years, as have many Dracula scholars. But I have looked at it as ways to get material to include in books, things that Bram maybe left out of some of of his writing of Dracula, and hints towards things that he meant to put in, and so on. So when it comes to sort of my family's legacy, that is one of the prime destinations. We sort of joke and call it the pilgrimage to figuring out why Bram wrote Dracula. Bram never wrote an autobiography. So he leaves it to a lot of folks like myself and people who are much more scholarly than I to try to figure out what was the inspiration, what were the motivations, what were the things in Bram's life that led to him writing Dracula. And my mission has been to sort of try to play catch up on that, try to draw some of my own conclusions. I have enjoyed not only trying to find out what Bram Stoker wrote, but that sort of human side of why he wrote it. And that's some of the things I'm going to share with you folks today. I've sort of looked at Bram's writing of Dracula as a perfect storm, so to speak. A number of events in his own personal life sort of came together so that he would be very sensitive to superstitions, to spiritualism, to the afterlife, to the occult, possibly even rejecting formal religion in a subtle way, looking at life through different lenses when the first 7 years of your own life were spent very sickly, possibly as an invalid, never knowing if the next asthma attack or the next fever was going to kill you. He wrote a little bit about that in a book called Personal Reminiscence of Henry Irving. That's the only place where he's actually included some things about himself. Irving and I did this. I did this en route to going doing this with Irving. So we get little hints of Bram and some of the things he feels about, but not too many. We still got to connect the dots, or as I say, put the pieces of the puzzle together. And one of the pieces, folks, that I'm going to delve into is something that has been around for a while, but hasn't really come out in the forefront. And that is one of the stories that Bram Stoker's mother told him when he was a sickly little boy. So you got to imagine he was the third child. There was a number after him. So there was all 7 kids born by the time Bram actually recovered from this illness and got on to being a sort of a somewhat normal kid, an adolescent going through a huge growth spurt. Obviously, there was some awkwardness there, but also trying to play catch up with his education so he could get on and become a student that ends up thriving at Trinity College. So it was a strange and weird childhood. And between his mom and his nanny, they needed to educate him. And in those days, there obviously wasn't distance learning like they do now. And with this epidemic, there's storytelling essentially. And we know now for sure one of those stories. And the provenance is kind of interesting because years later, when Bram was a young man and starting to write, he requested of his mother to send this particular story to him. Now, Bram's mom and father and Bram's two sisters had moved to France and then to Switzerland so that the two girls could get the very best education that they could possibly have in the arts. And one of them, Matilda, Bram's oldest sister, actually became quite a well-known artist. I've got a couple pieces of her work. Actually, one piece of her work is in the spine. Actually, I'll pull it off the shelf here because it's really pretty cool. We asked the publisher of Dracule if they wouldn't include a piece of Matilda's artwork in the book because she's an artist and she was an artist in our story. This is semi-autobiographical. So this piece right down the middle of the spine is Matilda Stoker's artwork. So there was definitely artistry in the family. Bram kind of was the one that shied away from the science. My great-grandfather was a doctor, and so were two of his other brothers, Thornley Stoker being the most famous one, who was actually knighted as he was the president of the Royal College of Surgeons of Ireland, and was knighted because of that. So we've got scientists in the family, we've got artists, and we've got Bram, who's sort of a little bit of both. And back to the story, he remembered this story so well from his childhood that he asked his mom to type it up and send it to him when she was off in France. So we've got a record of the story, and it's now living in the Trinity College archives in Dublin. And it's a horrific story. And it's so timely, folks, because of what we're living through right now. At the time in 1832, very similar thing happened. Now, back in those days, people were a little more used to these horrible pandemics, plagues, traveling through Europe, but not often did they make their way to the British Isles and to Ireland. They were, because they were a little more sort of sequestered. But obviously, ship travel, much like our airline travel, was what connected the world, and people and things like fleas and rats and things would carry all over the world. So this story that I'm going to read you, because I'm taking a while to frame it, but it's important. You've got to sort of understand the terror of it. People in Ireland lived relatively simple lives. They had no idea how to combat this. Even in 1832, their medicine was not very sophisticated. These are back, folks, of the days of bloodletting. And I believe Bram was bloodlet by one of his uncles. This was the leaching or the cutting and taking out large quantities of blood, enough until the patient would pass out, and then rehydrating them with red wine, claret, and oil to cleanse the system. The other thing that they didn't understand about was communicable diseases. How did they jump from one person to another? And the cholera, we have since learned, was in the water, was actually from the waste of human bodies, and also it could come out from the sweat and the blood of people. So it was very contagious. Touching somebody who was infected was pretty much a death sentence yourself. And many people were dying. The medical people were dying. The clergy, the people who were doing the funeral services, touching the body and so on, getting the body prepared, they were dying. So there was not a lot of dignity left in either the dying process or taking care of the dead. They usually just put people in a big pit at the end of the town, with some lime on them, with some dirt and more bodies, and tried to cover up the mass graves. Forget about the coffins and proper services and so on. So this story made its way back to Bram, and he actually used it in a children's book called Under the Sunset, which was a series of short stories. And this story by Charlotte Stoker, the cholera story as we call it, became The Invisible Giant, which again is a sort of another metaphor for the invisible invader, the giant that is slowly coming over the town and killing the people. So as I read it, I want you to imagine this fertile mind of young Bram Stoker, who goes on to write Dracula, the story of bodies coming out of the graves, the spirits living on, the undead. Because I believe that this had a big impact on him, obviously enough for he requested it to come from his mom, and obviously enough for him to use it in a short story. But I think it kind of sat in the recesses of his mind and created a very macabre dark sense of imagination that years later, and we'll get to this, when he started doing research and found, lo and behold, that there were other people in Europe that had these experiences with plagues and communicable diseases that they couldn't understand, and they were sort of racking them up to be what they believed to be vampires. So it's it takes probably 20 minutes or so to read this, so bear with me. I do the best I can, and imagine that you are young Bram, lying in bed, and your mother is telling you this story. It's copyright Bram Stoker Estate, written by Charlotte Stoker, called The Cholera Horror. In the days of my early youth, the world was shaken with the dread of a new and terrible plague, which was desolating all lands as it passed through them. And so regular was its march that men could tell where next it would appear, and almost the day when it might be expected. It was the cholera, which for the first time appeared in Western Europe. Its bitter, strange kiss, and man's want of experience or knowledge of its nature, or how best to resist its attacks, added, if anything could, to its horrors. In those days, I lived with my parents and brothers in a provincial town in the west of Ireland called Sligo. It was long before the time of railroads, and I think of steamboats, as news traveled slowly. Rumors of the Great Plague broke on us from time to time, as men talk of far-off things which can never come near themselves. But gradually, the terror grew on us, as we heard of it coming nearer and nearer. It is in France, they said. Is it in Germany? It is in England. Then, with wild affright, we began to hear the whisper passed amongst men. It is in Ireland. Men's senses began failing them for fear, and deeds were done in selfish dread, enough to call down God's direct vengeance on us. One action I vividly remember. A poor traveler was taken ill on the roadside, some miles from town. And how did those Samaritans tend to him? They dug a pit, and with long poles pushed him living into it, and covered him up quick, alive, like Sodom did our city pay for such crimes. Trenches were now cut across the roads in the direction in which the cholera was said to come, concisely for the purpose of stopping all intercourse with the infected districts. No use at all. One evening we heard that a Mrs. Feeney, a very fat woman who was a music teacher, had died suddenly, and by the doctor's orders had been buried an hour after. With blanched faces, men looked at each other and whispered, "Cholera." But the whispers next day deepened to a roar, and in many houses lay one, nay 2 or 3 dead. One house would be attacked and the next spared. There was no telling who would go next, and when one said goodbye to a friend, he said it as if forever. In a few days, the town became a place of the dead. No vehicles moved except for the cholera carts or the doctor's carriages. Many people fled, and many of these were overtaken by the plague and died by the same. Some of the doctors made a good thing of it, as they said themselves, at first, but one by one they too became victims, and others came and filled the gaps, and then others again filled their places. Most of the clergy of all denominations fled, and few indeed were the instances where the funeral services were read over the dead. The great county infirmary and fever hospital was turned into a cholera hospital, but was quite insufficient to meet the requirements of the situation. The nurses died one after another, and none could be found to fill their places. But women of the worst description, who were always more than half drunk, and such scenes were perpetrated there as would make the flesh creep to hear of. One Roman Catholic priest remained. There may have been more, but I only knew of this one. His name was Gillern, And he told us himself that he was obliged to sit day after day and night after night on top of the great stone stairs with a horsewhip to prevent those wretches dragging the patients down the stairs by the legs with their heads dashing on the stone steps before they were dead. The habit was, when a new batch arrived for whom there were no beds, to take those who were so stupefied from opium and nearest death and remove them to make room for the new arrivals. Many were said to be buried alive. One man brought his wife to the hospital on his back, and she being in great agony, he tied a red scarf tightly around her waist to try and relieve the pain. When he came again to the hospital in the evening, he heard that she was dead and lying in the dead house. He sought her body to give it a more decent burial than could be given there. The custom was to dig a large trench, put in 40 or 50 corpses without coffins, throw lime on them, and cover the grave. He saw the corner of his red scarf under several bodies, which he removed, and found his wife was there, and there was still life in her. He carried her home, and she recovered and lived many years. There was a remarkable character in town, a man of great stature, who had been a soldier and was usually known as Long Sergeant Callan. He took the cholera, was thought dead, and a coffin was brought. As the coffin maker had always a stack of coffins ready on hand, with burials following immediately on the deaths, they were much of a uniform size and, of course, too short for Long Sergeant Callan. The men who were putting him in, when they found he would not fit, took a big hammer to break his legs and make him fit. The first blow roused the sergeant from his stupor, and he started up and recovered. I often saw the man afterwards. Our own house gradually ceased to go out or hear what went on outside. The last evening we were out, we went to see the family of the collector of excise, Mr. Holmes. They were a large family, a father, mother, grandmother, 3 or 4 sons, 3 daughters, and a little grandchild. We left them all at 9 p.m., and the next morning, at 9 o'clock, we heard that Mr. Holmes, his mother, 2 sons, a daughter, and the little child were all dead and buried. After that, which occurred the 6th day of the cholera, we stayed pretty much in the house. There was a constant fumigation kept up. Plates of salt, on which vitriolic acid was poured from time to time, were placed outside all the windows and the doors. Every morning, as soon as we awoke, a dose of whiskey, thickened with ginger, was given us all in quantities according to our ages. Gradually, the street in which we lived thinned out. As by 2s and 3s, our dead neighbors were carried away. One morning, the 9th day, 4 were carried at once, dead, out of the opposite house. Our neighbors on both sides died. On one side, a little girl called Mary Sheridan was left alone and sick, and we could hear her cries. I begged my mother to let me go and help her, and she let me go, with many fears. Poor Mary died in my arms an hour after. I returned home, and being well fumigated, was not affected. Some descriptions of provisions became almost impossible to get. Milk, most of all, as none of the country people could be induced to come near the doomed town. We had a cow, and many persons, ladies whom we did not know except by sight, used to come and beg a little milk for their young children. These jugs used to be left on the doorstep, filled and taken away. At night, many tar barrels and other combustible matters used to be burned along the street to try and purify the air, and they had a weird, unearthly look, gleaming out in the darkness. The cholera carts and the cots had bells which added to the horror, and the coffin maker, a man named Young, used to knock on the doors to inquire if any coffins were wanted. This was a climax too hard to bear. Few nerves could stand it, and we asked Young to desist. But still he would come, and one day I told him, that if he came again, I would throw water on him. Next day he knocked as usual, and out went the full of a big jug on his head. The fellow shook himself, looked up at me with a diabolical grin, shook his fist, and said, "If you die in an hour, you shall not have a coffin." "Thank you," said I. "In that case, I shan't care." He came no more. Day by day went without any change. The plague was not stayed. Every morning at daybreak, a cry used to go out from room to room over the house. "Is anyone dead?" But we were mercifully spared. In our whole lone street, only Dr. Little's family and our own remained without a loss. On some days, the cholera was more fatal than others, and on those days we could see a heavy sulphurous-looking cloud hanging low over the house, and we heard that birds were found dead on the shores of Loch Gill. Early on the morning of the 14th day, my mother heard a great commotion among the poultry in the backyard, and on going out, she found several of them dead or dying. She came in and said it was time for us to go and to pack up. So we put a few things, sent the cow to a meadow in the neighborhood where there was water, begged the people near to milk her and make use of the milk, and at 10 o'clock we, that is my father, mother, 2 brothers, myself, and the servant, started on the mail coach for Ballyshannon, where lived some of my father's friends, who we were sure would receive us for a few days till we could get some place to live in. It was a damp, drizzling morning, and we felt very miserable, as if we had a forewarning of what lay before us. All went well until we got within about a mile of a village, about 4 miles from Ballyshannon, when the coach was met and stopped by a mob of men armed with sticks, scythes, and pitchforks. They were headed by a Dr. John Shields, who was half mad. He was the son of one of the first physicians and most respected men in our county, but he did not take after his father. The coach was stopped, and we were ordered out, our luggage taken off, and no entreaties could prevail on those men to allow us to pass. Fear had maddened them. After a long parley and many threats of the vengeance of the law, the coach was allowed to proceed, and we were left on the roadside, sitting on our trunks, cold, wet, hungry, and well-nigh hopeless. My father feared to leave us to go and seek assistance, but after about an hour and a half, we saw my uncle's carriage and hack chaise coming towards us. One of my cousins was in the carriage. The family had heard our situation, and he had come out to try to bring us in. An old servant of the family, who had a livery stable, had brought his chaise for the sake of old times. We got into the carriages, and when we neared Ballyshannon, found we would not be allowed to remain. All we could get leave to do was drive through the town. My uncle had an old friend, a Mrs. Walker in Donegal, about 20 miles further on, and he advised our going there and wrote to beg her to receive us for a little while. So on we went, my mother and we children in the chaise, and my father, the servant and luggage in the open carriage. It was now raining as if heaven and earth were coming together, and after driving for about 10 miles, my father looked very ill. Our store of cholera medicines, without which no one moved a yard, was produced, but we had no vessel to mix them in. So one of the drivers had to run to a cabin in the fields and beg the loan of a mug and a little water. The woman gave it, but on the mug being returned, she broke it into pieces, and when offered some money, said if we left it on the road, she would take it up after a while, but feared to touch anything from our hands. My father's illness was not cholera, but the result of a cold, anxiety, and exhaustion, and he was soon well enough to continue. We entered Donegal, but our arrival had been announced in some way, and we found the square where we entered full of men howling like devils. In a trice ourselves and our luggage were taken, or rather torn from the carriages. The luggage was piled in the center of the square. We were placed on it, and a cry went out, "Fire to burn the cholera people!" We thought our last hour had surely come, and sat as quiet as we could, and tried to be resigned to our fate. Fortunately, the officer in command of the regiment quartered in the town was a man of promptitude and humanity. The barracks gate opened into the square, and in an incredibly short time he ordered out the troops, who surrounded us in a square and faced the mob on all sides with fixed bayonets. We were now comparatively safe. But in what condition? Wet, cold, hungry, houseless, and surrounded by a howling multitude who would not even allow us to go on. Presently, a meeting of the magistrates was held to decide on what was to be done with us. And I regret to have to tell it of a minister of Christ. The bitterest and least merciful among them was the rector of the parish. In the meantime, some kind person sent us out a large jug of hot tea and a loaf, which we thankfully received. It was all the food we had that day. The magistrates decided that we should not be allowed to pass, but be sent back by the way we came, escorted by the military to protect us from the fury of the mob. So our carriages were again packed, and back we went with our escort, who left us about 7 miles on the road. We now held a council of war as to what was to be done, and the drivers advised that we should wait till dark, and they would drive us by a back way to our cousin's house in Ballyshannon, where we were sure of shelter if we could just get there. They walked the horses, and at about 10 at night we arrived without detection, and we were warmly received by our cousins. We were fed and our feet bathed and beginning to feel quite comfortable when there was a great uproar in the street, and the voice of our old enemy, Dr. John Shields, called for us to be brought out. By now we had the best of it, and our cousins refused to open the doors. The noises continued, and presently the chief magistrate of the town and 2 doctors arrived and civilly requested admittance. They were led in, and on promising to abstain from violence, and we had to submit to medical examination, we were declared free from cholera so far, but the house was put into quarantine, and no one let out for some days. At the end of that time, we were able to live in peace till the plague had abated, and we could return to Sligo. There we found the streets grass-grown, and 5/8 of the population dead. We had great reason to thank God, who had spared us all. Well, written by Charlotte Stoker, a young girl around 12 years old in 1832. As I said, just imagine young Bram Stoker hearing that, people being misdiagnosed and buried alive. I believe Bram's illness was respiratory allergies and asthma. There still is that in the family, and as many of you, if you listeners are asthmatic or you know what I mean, it's pretty brutal. Bram writes that he's had the feeling of not knowing if he's drawing his last breath, and I can just imagine if he went into one of these states, maybe he's getting these weird fantasies that somebody may misdiagnose and put him in the grave. So this is sort of the part of that perfect storm of Bram's personal experience. So imagine if you sort of fast forward to the years he goes into the libraries, the British Museum Library, the London Library, the Whitby Library, and starts finding books and treatises about these plagues in Eastern Europe, and actually all over Europe, and it's not just isolated to Europe, it was America as well, where they had contagious diseases like consumption or tuberculosis and bubonic plague and things like that. This is what people of a superstitious nature, in a way, were believing / fantasizing that this was vampirism, that as people would die from a contagious disease and buried, others in the family would catch the disease, and for 3 or 4 days they would be slowly declining. These folks were believing that the spirit of the dead or the actual undead was coming out and sucking the life out of the others in the family. So what they would do was go to the grave and do one of these, what we hear about in these treaties, these exhumations, and they would either stake the body into the ground or take out the heart and burn it at crossroads, any of these rituals that have been discovered all over the world, and sort of answer how people's ignorance was sort of chalked up to being, superstitions surrounding these deaths and vampires being the answer. I've been lucky enough to get into the London Library. It's a private library, and find all the books that Bram used for research. And some of these books that are actually written by medical doctors and men of the church mention things like popular superstitions and truths contained within, or the other world glimpse of supernatural. And it goes into these details about vampirism and trance and sleepwalking and all these things that I think clicked with Bram from his personal experience as a kid to then now he's digging deeper. He needs to have some good, solid material for his book, Dracula, that will give the sense that this story is based on something real. And that's the real horrors that these people experienced. So did Bram Stoker believe vampires existed? I think not necessarily. He had a very open mind about the supernatural and spiritualism, but I think he certainly believed that there were many people all over the world that believed that this was a true thing. And here's actually a short excerpt from the British Weekly that it was a newspaper, the only interview that Bram has ever been found about Dracula. And Jane Stoddard asked Bram Stoker, where did this whole idea of the vampire myth come from? Bram says, it is undoubtedly a very fascinating theme, since it touches both on mystery and fact. In the Middle Ages, the terror of the vampire depopulated whole villages. She says, where was this prevalent? He said, certain parts of Styria, which is Austria, it survived the longest, and with most intensity, the legend is common to many countries, to China, Iceland, Saxony, Turkey, the Chersonese, which is the Greek peninsula, Russia, Poland, Italy, France, England, and all the Tartar communities, which is where Mongolia, Genghis Khan, and all that. So Bram found in these libraries the fact that well-respected people, Dr. Herbert Mayo, Frederick George Leah Reverend, believed all this stuff to be true. And then Bram went to America with the Lyceum Theater, and he stumbled on an even more important, sort of relevant article. And it's very cool. I'm going to read you a short excerpt from it. But it was in the New York World newspaper from 1896. So this is while Bram is writing Dracula. And this article is about the New England vampire scare of the late 1800s. And what was happening at that time, folks, is that they had an outbreak of tuberculosis, and a lot of the people that were living in New England, or a lot of the elderly people, I should say, living in New England, actually came from Eastern Europe to work in the coal mines, in the lumber industry, work the farms. They retained a lot of these superstitions that had sort of percolated since the 1700s about these weird, unexplained deaths and being answered really sort of understood in reality. People wanted to have a tangible reason to understand how these things were happening. They didn't understand germ theory, but they did understand the superstition of the vampire. So in this newspaper, it connected the vampire scare with what was really bizarre, which was Charles Darwin, the scientist in England who had just written 1859, The Origin of the Species, which rocked the scientific world, scared the heck out of everybody. This is the end of the 1800s when all things were changing, and some people didn't like change, they didn't accept change, and others were being blown away by it. Bram Stoker and Mark Twain, who was a neighbor of his, Arthur Conan Doyle, Henry Irving, these other people were accepting this, but they had to do this in secret societies like the Freemasonry, Order of the Golden Dawn. New things and new thinking, free thinking had to be done behind closed doors in those days. But let me just read you an excerpt from this this article, because when I think Bram read it, he was like, he hit pay dirt. And it was that, here's the headline, belief in the vampire bat is more modern. For a long time, it was ridiculed by science as a delusion, but it has been proved to be found correctly on fact. It was the famous naturalist Charles Darwin who settled this question. In Coquimbo, Chile, a servant caught a bat in the act of sucking the blood from the flank of one of his horses. Bram used this information by having Quincy Morris say almost exactly the same words, that when Van Helsing is trying to explain to the band of heroes that there's a vampire around, Quincy pops up and says, yes, when I was in South America on these maneuvers, these adventures, vampire bats would come out of the trees and drink so much blood from my horse, I had to put her down. Now, we know for sure that the vampire bats didn't drink that much blood, but that's the artistic or poetic license that the author takes to, to sort of round out the story, but it's based on fact. So we're at 10 minutes to 7. I just need to ask Kevin, how much longer do I have?
You got about 10 minutes. I did want to add something.
Please do.
My own research, funny enough, there was graves that were found around, I think, 2014 in Poland that were prepared for fear of vampires. They had things like if the corpse got up, it would cut the head off. And it turns out that these people that Polish people thought were vampires had actually suffered from cholera.
Yeah.
So this all interrelates very
ties
nicely.
in. Yeah. Yeah. It's strange. Without understanding germ theory, these folks would, as I said, go through these strange rituals because they believe that, the bodies were coming out. Kevin, besides the metal around the neck or the stakes, sometimes metal stakes, did you ever find anything about the bricks in the mouth in Italy?
Yes.
I found one of these treaties, which was the chewing dead.
Mm-hmm.
And what was happening is that Venice, Italy, being very sort of the earth being, the water table being high, so they couldn't bury the bodies very deep. And when one of these plagues ran through Venice, there was a find, I think 10 years ago, by a guy called Borini that had found all these bodies in a mass grave, and a few of them actually had bricks in the mouth. And not just, by earth moving and so on. This was really obviously put in for good reason. And he discovered this treatise by Philip Rohr that was Latin, the chewing dead. This is kind of gross, but it fits this con quite nicely. Imagine 400 bodies in a shallow grave, and as the bodies decompose and the heads being backwards, and as the skin comes off and the tendons and ligaments start to decompose, and the ones of the jaw are some of the strongest in the body, they go last, and the jaws would then crunch down together and make a crunching noise. And it sounded to the villagers on the upper side, on the other side of the world, on our side of the world, that something in this pile was chewing to come out. So they would exhume this mass grave, and they found the bodies with the shrouds around them and all this sort of blood and juice and whatever it was they didn't know around the shroud. It looked like this was trying to chew its way out of the shroud, when in fact this is just the decomposition juices that go with the normal process. They don't see it that much, and the bellies were quite fattened, which is the gases of decomposition. So they thought that the bodies had a big messy meal of blood. Mm-hmm. So there is one more thing I want to read just before I finish up here.
Please do.
And it comes back to the realism of Dracula and the realism that J.D. Barker and I utilized to our advantage when we wrote Dracul. Because the premise of this story, and Kev, you were there when we had our launching in Rosenbach, was that Dracul is a story of Bram Stoker's life and that of his sister and his brother and all these people who ended up, I believe, being featured, even though the names are changed to Seward and Van Helsing and Mina. They're all people in Bram's life, and for good reason, because he had some reason to believe vampires were real, just like all these other folks I was telling you about. And what I'm going to read you to end my chat today was discovered in 1989 to be the original preface of Dracula that was published in Sweden and then in Iceland. And a friend of mine, Hans de Roos, discovered the whole thing in Iceland, that it's been sitting there since 1901 to be a different edition of Dracula than we all know today. It's since been published as The Powers of Darkness, and I actually wrote the intro to it. So I have a fairly close knowledge of what Hans found and the process he went through. But the coolest thing is, and this is what I really started the ball rolling with J.D. Barker when I said, J.D., we've got to write this book together. Here's some of my ideas. The story is real. And Bram Stoker wrote Dracula as a warning to the world that vampires are real. Here is the preface. The reader of the story will very soon understand how the events outlined in these pages have been gradually drawn together to make a logical whole. Apart from excising minor details, which I consider unnecessary, I have let the people involved relate their experiences in their own way. But for obvious reasons, I have changed the names of the people and the places concerned. In all other respects, I have left the manuscript unaltered in deference to the wishes of those who've considered it their duty to present it before the eyes of the public. I am quite convinced that there is no doubt whatever that the events here described really took place, however unbelievable and incomprehensible they might appear at first sight. And I am further convinced that they must always remain to some extent incomprehensible, although continuing research in psychology and the natural sciences may in years to come give logical explanations of such strange happenings which, at present, neither scientists nor the secret police can understand. I state again that this mysterious tragedy which is here described is completely true in all its external respects, though naturally I've reached a different conclusion on certain points than those involved in the story. But the events are incontrovertible, and so many people know of them that they cannot be denied. This series of crimes has not yet passed from memory, a series of crimes which appear to have originated from the same source, which at the same time created as much repugnancy in people everywhere as the murders of Jack the Ripper, which came into the story a little later. Various people's minds will go back to the remarkable group of foreigners who for many seasons together played a dazzling part in the life of the aristocracy here in London, and some will remember that one of them disappeared suddenly without apparent reason, leaving no trace. All the people who have willingly or unwillingly played a part in this remarkable story are known generally and are well respected. Both Jonathan Harker and his wife, who is a woman of character, and Dr. Seward are my friends and have been so for many years, and I have never doubted they were telling the truth. And the highly respected scientist who appears here under a pseudonym will also be too famous all over the educated world for his real name, which I have not desired to specify, to be hidden from people, least of all those who have from experience learned to value and respect his genius and his accomplishments, though they adhere to his views on life no more than I. But in our times, it ought to be clear to all serious-thinking men that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. The end. All right, Kevin, any questions or any closing thoughts?
I just want to share, you've definitely made some new fans in the chat. Teresa Hull, Gulf City Piggin, who's been with us all day, has said, I have too, I think, in reference to my reference, that people should check out your book, Dracul, and you made her housework enjoyable.
Okay. Thank goodness. Hope it wasn't too difficult. All right. Well, listen, y'all stay safe. And again, Kevin, thank you for going to the effort to make this Wrath of the Khan work. I really appreciate it. I know lots of us who are shut in because of this really appreciate the exposure, and thank you for doing it.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've had a blast all day. You've been a great inclusion. I'm glad you were able to join us. Remember, I know you're a busy guy, but you're welcome for the later, not long now, because it'll only be at 8:15 EST, the free-for-all where all the guests are welcome to come back and just hang out a little.
All right, man. Thanks so much. Y'all take care.
Okay, have a good evening.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, folks, that was Dacre Stoker, the great-grandnephew of Bram. Very good guy. We're now waiting for the next guest on the chopping block, who is Arthur Moyer. Let me shoot a message. But yeah, I hope everybody has been enjoying the convention so far. I'm personally having a really great time. I had to wonder I mean, I know all the guests personally, and they're all great people. But yeah, I have to wonder when you're going to sit in a chair for, let's see, I've been here since about 12:30. So I've been here about sitting in this chair, except for getting up to get drinks or go to the bathroom, for the last 6.5 hours, and I don't regret it one bit. Granted, I definitely need to stretch a little bit more. Um, it's been a fun night. Does anybody have any questions or comments so far about what's been going on? Arthur is definitely going to be an interesting departure from what we've done so far, since we've had authors, a bunch of them, absolutely amazing authors on, some great people. Arthur is more a very different take, granted, but more my neck of the woods as somebody involved in the actual cult as opposed to just someone who writes stories about it. He's as he's put it before, he's the token magician of various groups I've put together throughout the years, as well as, yeah, I mean, he does. I'm going to do magic tomorrow, but I'm going to do stage magic. I'm going to do prestidigitation, conjuring, as it's sometimes called. He does the actual thing. And he's going to talk about that. It should be a very interesting talk. And I'm currently, again, largely filling time between one guest and the next. Thank you, Brian Mannix, and Alex, and Chibi Dice Botch. I'm glad you guys have enjoyed it. I have to give a lot of credit to my guests. Keep in mind, I had this idea about a month ago of, hey, why don't we do this thing? And I sent messages out, and people just jumped on in and said, yeah, okay, I'll do it. So it's worked out fantastically well. I couldn't really have predicted that it would have been the success that it is. And I'm grateful that it has been. I'm glad that you guys are enjoying it. We haven't had insane numbers, certainly, but that's okay. I mean, the videos will be up in the future. Hopefully we'll get people will come by and look at it. And again, this is not a monetization thing. This is not a me make money thing. This is, if you guys have money you want to spend, donate it to, seriously, please, if you can, donate to Save the Children. There are people out there that really need help. I'm doing okay. If for that matter, you can also consider buying some of the books of the authors that we've had on. There's links in everybody's description to where you can get them on Amazon. Some of them are very, very reasonably priced. But we're still largely stuck inside. It's nice to have a good book to read, in my opinion. And you can get all this stuff online. You can get, if you like audiobooks, you can get audio, Dacre's books in audio. You've got plenty of options. And I think it's a really cool thing. And let me think. So the problem is the time delay between the two. I should have given a little more thought to. Well, what am I going to do between guests? Okay. I just heard back from Arthur. I think he'll be joining us shortly, so I won't be hanging in the wind too long. And I want to be clear. It's not Arthur's fault. It's not Dacre's fault that I'm hanging in the wind by any means. There is a schedule that we've more or less followed, although there's been some shifting just to deal with various issues. I'd also suggest that any of you folks that aren't necessarily into the occult side of magic, stick around. Arthur has a very unique perspective on things. Even Teresa, given the Teresa Hall Gulf City Pig, and I'm guessing a thing or two about magic. I think Arthur's perspective on it will surprise you. I'm not a practitioner of any kind, but I've studied the subject over the years because it kind of relates to demonology. as you could guess. And Arthur has a perspective on it I've never seen anyone else put forward. It makes for a very interesting take on the whole thing. Yeah, there's something else again. It's interesting. It's different. It's tomorrow we're going to get back more into the fiction stuff. Certainly. So if this isn't your cup of tea, I certainly get that. And I think that sound should indicate that he's joining us. Do those of us who? Well, that's a good question for Arthur. We can ask him. Arthur, are you there? Yes. Hello, can you hear me? Okay, hopefully you can hear me, but I can't hear you. And it's not the problem we had earlier because I've got the sound turned all the way up. Maybe
Try that.
Arthur. Oh yeah, now I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can, sir. I can hear you just fine. I was just getting the microphone switched over. Each application always seems to want to grab a different microphone.
Yeah, understandable. So I'm going to switch us over in a second. As you may know, I've been starting a new stream for each person, so everybody has their own little thing, so people can go back, watch who they want. I do have one question I want to relay, which is Teresa Hall, Gulf City Pagan, who's a regular listener of mine, wants to know if the magic practitioners in the audience should take notes.
They have in the past. This was from my magic convention called Crucible from many years ago. So if they're into this kind of thing, then sure, take notes. If they just want to be entertained, then that's fine too.
I think Teresa will. I think they'll find you interesting. But here, you just stay put. I'm going to do the switch over in YouTube so that we have the independent video. And those of you listening on YouTube, just give me a minute, and then it'll be back up, and you're good to go. So, and